I never expected that a transatlantic flight, the very epitome of controlled chaos and recycled air, would dismantle the life I had so carefully constructed. My life was a grid, a series of straight lines and right angles drawn in muted colors. I was a graphic designer, and my work was my world, a place where every pixel could be nudged into perfect alignment, where kerning could be adjusted to the hundredth of a point, where chaos could be subdued by logic and a well-chosen color palette. My apartment was the same. Books arranged by spine color, coffee mugs hung in a precise order, a life curated to minimize friction and surprise. Flying was a necessary violation of this order, a surrender to a metal tube hurtling through the void, and I endured it with a set of rigid rituals designed to build a fortress around myself. Aisle seat, always. Noise-canceling headphones, a silent mode. A bottle of specifically sourced mineral water, a familiar taste in an alien environment. I built my temporary home in seat 14C, a small kingdom of solitude. And then he arrived, and the walls of my kingdom began to feel like paper. He was the last to board, a quiet storm of apologies and efficient movement. He was tall, with shoulders that seemed to take up the entire width of the aisle, forcing him to turn slightly to navigate the narrow passage. He was a disruption of scale, a sudden introduction of mass and gravity into my carefully controlled space. He was headed for 14A, the window seat, the one separated from me by an empty middle. I watched him from behind the cover of my book, my heart performing a strange, unwelcome staccato against my ribs. He moved with a kind of grounded grace, stowing a worn leather satchel in the overhead bin with an easy, fluid motion. He smelled of sandalwood and clean, cold air, a scent that cut through the cabin's stale perfume of jet fuel and disinfectant. He settled into his seat, and for a blissful moment, the empty chair between us, 14B, was a demilitarized zone, a buffer that kept his world from touching mine. He nodded a polite, fleeting acknowledgement in my direction, his eyes a deep, thoughtful brown. They didn't linger. I was just another anonymous traveler, a piece of the cabin's scenery. I told myself this was for the best. He was an art installation to be admired from a distance, a perfectly composed photograph I could appreciate but never touch. My gaze kept snagging on the details of him. The dark, thick hair that curled just over the collar of his simple gray sweater, the strong column of his neck, the way his hands, resting on his thighs, looked both powerful and gentle. They were hands that built things, I thought. Steady hands. Then, a woman with a boarding pass and a flustered expression stopped at our row. My stomach sank. She was 14B. The buffer was gone. She settled in, and suddenly his world was pressed against mine. The armrest became a contested border. His leg, clad in dark denim, was a constant line of warmth just millimeters from my own. I tried to make myself smaller, to shrink into the confines of my seat, but his presence was an undeniable physical fact. It had a temperature, a scent, a weight that seemed to alter the very air I was breathing. I saw the ring then, a simple, unadorned band of silver on his left ring finger. It wasn't flashy, it was worn, with the soft patina of time and constancy. The sight of it was like a lock clicking shut. It solidified the narrative I had already begun to write for him. He was a husband, probably a father. He existed in a completely different universe, one of shared lives and domestic certainties, a world I orbited but could never enter. The ring was the final velvet rope, the last pane of museum glass between us. It made him safe to observe, to admire. It made the low, insistent hum of attraction inside me a foolish, harmless thing, a secret I could keep folded away in the quiet of my own mind for the duration of the flight. It was a familiar ache, this quiet admiration for the unattainable. It was a cornerstone of the fortress I had built around my heart. For the first 2 hours, I existed in this state of hyper-aware observation. I pretended to read my novel, but the words were just black marks on a page. My true focus was on the man beside me. He had pulled out a tablet, and the screen glowed with what looked like architectural blueprints, intricate lines, and detailed renderings. An architect, then. It suited him. The idea of him creating structures, bringing order from chaos, resonated with his steady presence. I cataloged the minutiae of his existence in seat 14A. The way he would chew on the inside of his cheek when concentrating. The low, almost inaudible hum he made when he was scrolling through a document. The focused intensity in his eyes, which made the space around him feel quiet and purposeful. I was an archivist of a life I would never know, collecting sensory data that felt both intimate and intrusive. The scent of his cologne had faded into a more personal smell, something like warm skin and wool and the faint, clean trace of soap. It was maddening. It was a proximity that felt like a kind of emotional torture, a nearness that only highlighted the infinite distance between us. I retreated deeper into myself, turning up the volume on my headphones, trying to drown him out, but his presence was a low frequency I could feel in my bones. Then the world fell away. It started as a gentle shudder, the kind of bump that was common over the Atlantic. I tightened my grip on the armrest, my knuckles going white. My carefully constructed calm was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over a deep, cold lake of fear. I hated flying. I hated the surrender of control, the physics of it that I didn't trust, the cold, hard fact of being suspended 7 miles above a merciless ocean. The gentle shudder became a violent lurch. The plane dropped, a sickening, weightless plunge that stole the breath from my lungs and sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my system. A collective gasp echoed through the cabin, followed by the sound of a shattering glass from the galley. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, strained and tight, trying to project a calm that felt utterly false. "Flight attendants, please take your seats immediately." That was when the real fear began. The plane was bucking like a wild animal, a relentless, jarring motion that rattled my teeth. The lights flickered, died, then came back on at half power, casting the cabin in a dim, apocalyptic twilight. My fortress of solitude didn't just crumble, it was obliterated in an instant. The ice broke. My breathing hitched. My vision began to tunnel, the edges blurring into a dark vignette. My heart was a frantic hammer against my ribs, too fast, too loud. This was it. The panic attack. A cold sweat bloomed on my forehead and the back of my neck. I was losing control, my body betraying my mind's desperate attempts to remain logical. The noise in my headphones was gone, replaced by the roar of blood in my ears and the creaking groans of the airplane's frame. I was drowning. A voice cut through the fog. "Are you okay?" It was low and steady, a rock in the torrent of my panic. It was him. I turned my head, a slow, robotic motion. He was looking at me, his brown eyes wide with concern. The blueprints were gone. His full attention was on me. In that moment, he wasn't an architect, or a husband, or a stranger. He was an anchor. I tried to form a word, to say "I'm fine," the universal lie, but my throat had closed up. All I could manage was a short, sharp gasp for air. His expression softened with understanding. "Hey, look at me," he said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more intimate, a private bubble of sound in the surrounding chaos. "Just breathe with me, okay? In through your nose," he took a slow, deliberate breath, a clear demonstration. "And out through your mouth." I tried to follow his lead, but my lungs refused to cooperate. My breaths were shallow, useless sips of air. The plane lurched again, and an involuntary whimper escaped my lips. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for an impact that felt terrifyingly imminent. And then I felt it. A warmth. A pressure. His hand was covering mine on the armrest. It wasn't a tentative or accidental touch. It was firm, deliberate, and impossibly grounding. His hand was large, enveloping mine completely. His skin was warm and slightly calloused, a map of a life lived in the physical world. The shock of the contact was a lightning strike, a jolt of pure sensory input that momentarily silenced the screaming panic in my head. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice a vibration I could feel through our joined hands. "I've got you. Just focus on my hand." Feel the pressure. His thumb began to move in a slow, steady circle on the back of my hand. It was a simple, repetitive motion, a hypnotic rhythm that gave my spiraling mind something to cling to. In, out, circle. The world narrowed to that single point of contact, the friction of his skin against mine, the incredible, solid warmth of him. I opened my eyes and focused on our hands, his wrapped around mine, a silent testament of care from a man who owed me nothing. Slowly, painstakingly, my breathing began to even out. I matched my inhalations to the upward stroke of his thumb, my exhalations to the downward curve. The roaring in my ears subsided, replaced by the drone of the engines and the sound of his quiet, even breathing next to me. The worst of the turbulence seemed to be passing, the violent jolts softening into a more manageable, rolling motion. But he didn't let go. His hand remained over mine, a steadfast presence. After a few minutes of blessed, relative calm, he spoke again, his voice still low and close. "Hate this part," he admitted, his gaze directed forward, but his words were meant only for me. "Always feels like we're just tempting fate, hanging up here in a metal tube." He let out a slow breath. "Had a flight a few years back, to Tokyo. Engine caught fire on takeoff. We had to dump fuel and make an emergency landing. Ever since then," he trailed off, shaking his head slightly. His confession was a gift. It was a crack in the smooth, confident facade I had imagined for him. He wasn't just a stoic protector. He was scared, too. He carried his own fear, his own history. It recontextualized his gesture entirely. He wasn't just calming a stranger. He was sharing a lifeline, extending a comfort he himself likely needed. The silver ring on his finger seemed to lose some of its definitive power. It was no longer a symbol of a separate life, but just a piece of metal on a man who was afraid of falling out of the sky, just like me. In that shared vulnerability, the immense distance between us collapsed into nothing. We were just two people, trapped in a box in the clouds, holding on. Hours passed. The cabin lights were dimmed for the long, dark stretch of the overnight flight. The turbulence had settled into a distant memory, but an invisible thread of connection now lingered between us. He had eventually, reluctantly, removed his hand from mine, but the warmth of it seemed to have left a permanent imprint on my skin. We started talking, our voices low so as not to disturb the sleeping passengers around us. We talked about our jobs. He was Julian, an architect who specialized in sustainable urban design. He spoke about his work with a quiet passion, describing the beauty of clean lines and functional spaces, of buildings that breathed with their environment. I told him I was Elias, a graphic designer. I found myself explaining the strange satisfaction of creating a perfect logo, of telling a story with nothing but color, shape, and typography. It was easy, shockingly easy. The conversation flowed without the usual awkwardness I felt with new people. The shared crisis had burned away all the pretense, leaving behind a raw, honest foundation. We talked about cities we loved, his, a bustling hub of history and art, mine, a quieter, more reserved place by the sea. We talked about books and films and the surprisingly terrible coffee the airline served. With every shared laugh, every quiet admission, the man I had invented in my head, the stoic, married archetype, dissolved, replaced by this complex, kind, and surprisingly funny person named Julian. The silver ring was still there, a persistent question mark, but I pushed the thought away. For now, in the dim, liminal space of the overnight flight, it was enough just to be near him. He stifled a yawn, his second in as many minutes. "Can't sleep," he murmured, shifting in his seat to face me more directly. The movement brought his knee into soft contact with mine. Neither of us pulled away. The small point of contact was a new anchor, a quiet acknowledgement of the space we now shared. "My brain won't shut off." "Mine either," I admitted. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a small case containing a pair of earbuds. He untangled the wire with practiced fingers. "Want to listen to something?" he offered. "It's just some ambient stuff. Sometimes helps." He held one of the small white buds out to me. My heart did that stupid, fluttering thing again. Sharing earbuds felt impossibly intimate, a gesture from a different kind of life, one that involved lazy Sunday mornings and shared secrets. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I took the earbud, my fingers brushing against his. The spark was still there, a low, steady current. I placed it in my ear, and he put the other in his. A soft, atmospheric soundscape filled my head, drifting synth pads and the gentle, distant sound of rain. To hear it properly, we had to lean closer together, our heads now just inches apart in the darkened cabin. I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, see the soft stubble on his jaw, smell the faint, lingering scent of sandalwood that was uniquely his. We sat like that in silence for a long time, listening to the rain that wasn't there, our shoulders pressed together. The world had shrunk to this tiny, shared universe of sound and warmth. Then, I felt his fingers gently brush against my hand, which was resting on my leg. It was a question. I didn't hesitate. I turned my palm upward, and he laced his fingers through mine. This time, it wasn't about comfort or panic. This was different. His grip was firm, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin of my palm. It was a deliberate, unambiguous statement. He leaned closer, his breath warm against my cheek. The ambient music seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the thundering of my own pulse. In the dim glow from the cabin's floor lighting, I could see his eyes searching mine. They were dark and deep, and I saw my own shock and hope reflected there. "Is this okay?" he whispered, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through me. I couldn't find my voice. All the words I owned had deserted me. So I just nodded, a small, jerky movement. It was all the permission he needed. He closed the remaining distance, and his lips met mine. The kiss was everything I had spent a lifetime telling myself I couldn't have. It was slow and tentative at first, a gentle exploration, a question asked and answered in the same moment. It tasted of the bad airline coffee and the mint he must have had earlier, but beneath that, it tasted of him. It was a taste of warmth and want. My mind, usually a raging torrent of overthinking and anxiety, went completely, blessedly silent. The carefully ordered grid of my life dissolved into a watercolor painting, colors bleeding into one another, soft and beautiful and undefined. There were no straight lines here. There was only the soft pressure of his mouth, the solid weight of his hand in mine, the overwhelming feeling of a door I thought was permanently locked suddenly swinging open. This was chaos. This was a freefall. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of falling. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, and I could feel his breath, warm and a little unsteady, on my lips. Neither of us spoke. There were no words for what had just happened, for the monumental shift that had occurred 35,000 feet in the air. He didn't pull away. He just stayed there, his hand still holding mine, our foreheads touching, sharing the same small pocket of air. In the quiet darkness of the cabin, surrounded by sleeping strangers, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. The spell was broken by the slow, artificial sunrise of the cabin lights coming on. It was a harsh, unwelcome intrusion. We pulled apart instantly, as if startled. The easy intimacy of the darkness evaporated under the fluorescent glare, replaced by a thick, suffocating awkwardness. I couldn't look at him. I stared intently at the gray plastic of the seat back in front of me, my face burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the cabin temperature. What had I done? The question screamed through my mind, the first soldier in an invading army of doubt and regret. The silence from the seat beside me was a damning verdict. I risked a sideways glance. Julian was staring out the window, his jaw tight, his posture rigid. He looked like a man who had made a profound mistake. And my anxiety, my oldest and most loyal companion, began its vicious work. The kiss wasn't real. It was a product of the strange, liminal space of a long-haul flight, a trauma bond forged in turbulence and fear, a moment of temporary madness. He was married. That silver ring was a fact, a solid piece of evidence against the fleeting, dreamlike memory of his lips on mine. He must be regretting it, disgusted with himself and with me. I had taken his kindness, his comforting hand, his shared music, and I had twisted it into something else. I had misread everything. I hadn't just made a fool of myself. I had potentially ruined things for him, complicated his life, his marriage. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe again. The orderly world I had lived in was gone, but the new one, this chaotic, uncertain landscape, was terrifying. A flight attendant came by with the breakfast cart, her cheerful voice grating on my frayed nerves. "Coffee? Tea? Coffee, please." "Black," Julian said, his voice clipped and formal. He didn't look at me. He took the cup and held it with both hands, staring into its dark surface as if it held the answers to the universe. The physical distance between us hadn't changed, but it felt like a vast, unbridgeable chasm had opened up. Every minute that passed in this crushing silence was another confirmation of my fears. I had built a fantasy, and now, in the harsh light of morning, it was turning to dust. The remainder of the flight was a special kind of hell, a slow-motion agony of unspoken words and averted gazes. I wanted to disappear. I wanted the ground to swallow the plane whole. Anything to end this excruciating limbo. The announcement came for our final descent. The thud of the landing gear locking into place felt like a gavel, signaling the end of this strange, suspended reality. Soon we would land, and he would walk away, back to his real life, his wife, his home. And I would be left with the ghost of a kiss and the bitter taste of my own foolishness. He finally turned to me. His face was unreadable, a mask of calm that I was certain hid a deep well of regret. My stomach twisted into a knot. I braced myself. "Elias," he said, his voice quiet but firm. It was the first time he had spoken my name since the sun had come up. "We should talk about that." This was it. The apology. The gentle letdown. The "I was not myself" speech. I nodded, unable to trust my own voice, and prepared for the inevitable impact. "I wasn't entirely honest with you," he began, his gaze steady and direct. He held up his left hand, turning it so the silver ring caught the light. My heart sank. "Here it comes. This ring," he said, his thumb rubbing over the worn metal. "It was my father's. He passed away last year. It was his wedding band." I stared at him, my brain struggling to process his words. "His father's. I wear it on this hand because it's the only one it fits," he continued, his voice softening. "And, I don't know. It makes me feel like he's still with me. Like I'm carrying a piece of him." He let his hand drop. "I'm not married, Elias. I'm not even dating anyone. I haven't for a long time." The world, which had been tilting precariously for hours, suddenly slammed back into place. But it was a new world, a different alignment. The foundations had shifted. Not married. His father's ring. The relief was so sudden and so absolute that it made me dizzy. It was a physical release, like a cord that had been wrapped tightly around my chest for hours had just been cut. "I saw you at the gate," he confessed, a faint blush creeping up his neck. "Before we boarded. You were reading, and you had this look of intense concentration on your face. I was hoping I'd be sitting near you." He let out a small, self-deprecating laugh. "Then the turbulence hit, and you looked so terrified. I don't know. Everything just felt accelerated. It felt important. I didn't want to land and just let you walk away. I didn't want to regret not knowing." My own confession tumbled out, a rush of whispered words. "I thought you were married. The ring. I saw it, and I just assumed. I've been sitting here for the last 2 hours convincing myself I'd completely lost my mind, that I'd imagined everything. I told him about watching him, about creating a whole life for him in my head, a life that had no room for me. I told him how I'd been so sure he regretted it." A slow, beautiful smile spread across his face, lighting up his eyes. "So I wasn't the only one," he said, the relief evident in his own voice. "I thought I'd scared you off. You were so quiet this morning." "I was terrified," I admitted. "Not of you. Of myself." The plane's wheels touched down on the tarmac with a gentle bump. We were on solid ground. As we taxied toward the terminal, he leaned in again. The awkwardness was gone, replaced by a certainty that felt as real and solid as the runway beneath us. This kiss was different from the first. There was no tentative question in it. It was an answer. It was deep and sure, a confirmation of everything that had just been said. It tasted of relief and hope and the promise of a new beginning. It felt, impossibly, like coming home. Walking through the bustling airport terminal felt surreal. We didn't touch, not yet. We were back in the real world, and the bubble of intimacy we had created on the plane felt too fragile to expose to the harsh lighting and anonymous crowds. But there was a new awareness between us, an invisible string that connected us across the few feet of space we kept. We were a secret, a story that only the two of us knew. At the baggage claim, amidst the rumble of the carousel and the crush of tired travelers, we exchanged phone numbers. It was such a laughably normal, terrestrial act after the celestial drama of the flight. It grounded us. It made what happened up there real. Our first date was coffee the next day. It was both wonderful and excruciatingly awkward. On the plane, we were two people in a crisis, stripped of all artifice. In a brightly lit coffee shop, we were strangers again, trying to learn the proper grammar of a new relationship. But the connection was still there, a low hum beneath the stilted conversation about our neighborhoods and our favorite kinds of coffee. By the end of our second cup, the awkwardness had faded, and we were talking as easily as we had in the dark. We began to build a life, not with grand gestures, but in the small, quiet moments. We discovered the intimate topography of each other's lives. I learned that he snored, a soft, low rumble that I found inexplicably comforting. He learned that I was a blanket thief. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of 80s action movies, which he watched with a completely unironic joy. I introduced him to the quiet, melancholy documentaries he pretended to find boring but would always ask thoughtful questions about afterward. We built a shared world out of cooking dinner together in his spacious, light-filled apartment, of holding hands under the table in dimly lit restaurants, of the quiet, profound comfort of just sitting in the same room, reading our respective books in a companionable silence. Months later, we were planning our first real vacation together, a trip to a quiet coastal town. We were sitting on his sofa, a laptop balanced between us, scrolling through flight options. The mundane act felt charged with significance. He paused, a thoughtful expression on his face, and then he turned to me, a slow, conspiratorial grin spreading across his lips. "I'll take the window seat," he said, his eyes twinkling. "But only if you promise to hold my hand if it gets bumpy." I laughed, a real, full-throated laugh. The sound felt good, felt right, in this space we had built together. "It's a deal," I said, leaning over to kiss him. I thought back to the man I was before that flight. A man who lived his life inside a fortress of his own design, where every wall was built with the bricks of routine and the mortar of fear. I had believed that order was safety, that solitude was strength. I had curated my world so carefully to avoid the beautiful, terrifying messiness of human connection. Julian hadn't laid siege to my fortress. He hadn't broken down the door. He had simply walked up to the gate, scared and vulnerable himself, and waited for me to let him in. The turbulence that I had feared would be the end of me had, in fact, been the beginning. It had shaken my world apart so that something new, something infinitely better, could be built in its place. It was the chaos my orderly life had been secretly starving for. It was the grounding force I never knew I needed.